Our next session is Truth Under Threat: Journalism versus Foreign Agent Laws. Please welcome our speakers to the stage.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jodie Ginsberg. I am the Chief Executive of the Committee to Protect Journalists. I was describing today's conference to a friend as the Hug Conference. I have very, very many dear friends here, and it has been such a difficult year for so many of us. I think everyone is so relieved to be in community. And I think that's important because of the very many threats that we face as a media community and as journalists. And you have just heard one of those reasons, the proliferation that we are seeing of foreign agent laws globally that suddenly put so many news outlets at grave risk. So today, for the next 45 minutes, I'm going to talk about that with a stellar panel. To my left, Alsu Kurmasheva, who is a press freedom advocate, an editor with the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Tata Bashkir service. I also describe her as one of my favorite criminals. We'll get to that. We'll get to that in a little bit. And a former winner of the CPJ International Press Freedom Award. Next to her is Yeginsu, deputy chair of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom, has worked on very many of these cases, and has really good insights into how we might think about tackling this issue. And next to Jan is Nick Slater, program manager for the Thomson Reuters Foundation. As you heard, the Thomson Reuters Foundation is doing really important work identifying some of these key trends, and so that we can really think about what are the effective tools that we can have to deal with this, not just at the state level, which is some of the work that Jan and his colleagues do, but really at the institutional level, at the level of the newsroom, because that's where it is felt most fully. So, Jan, we've just heard the great presentation on this issue that situated us really well. Can you talk a little bit about some of the most recent developments, in especially the expansion that we've seen of foreign agent laws out of places where we've traditionally thought of them, like Russia, into other countries?
Jodie, thank you very much, and thank you very much to Thomson Reuters Foundation for the very kind invitation. I mean, I think that's spot on, Jodie. I mean, what began really in the last 10 years as a Russia and Russia adjacent issue, this idea of having a foreign agents law and then using it first to close civic space, then journalistic space, etc., unfortunately has spread all across the world. So 2024, you have foreign agent laws introduced in Kyrgyzstan, Bosnia. Of course, we've heard about Georgia, but also Venezuela. You have a bill introduced in Turkey, in Paraguay. So around sort of one new bill every 2 months. 2025, we're almost at one new bill every month, with Slovakia, Serbia, Peru, El Salvador, Ecuador, and then, of course, the developments in Africa with Ethiopia and Uganda. So unfortunately, this has become a global spread, and as a result, looking at the other side of the coin, this is something that needs to be made a priority by democracies. There is some momentum afoot. The consultative network of the Media Freedom Coalition, which some of you will know is where the NGOs sit in the Media Freedom Coalition framework, have designated this a priority. The high-level panel in which I serve has designated this a priority. And several weeks ago, the OSCE brought together some experts to start thinking about solutions in this area. So this really is in the mainstream now, Jodie, and I'm really pleased we're talking about it today.
So we'll come back to talk about solutions in a second, but I want to really, we are very lucky to have Alsu here, because although we've heard some of these examples, I think it's only when you hear from somebody who's experienced it themselves what it is like to be accused of breaking foreign agent laws. So you were detained in Russia, first of all on sort of administrative charges, and eventually then charged with having failed to register as a foreign agent. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and what it was like to have those accusations made against you, and what the experience of being in prison was like for you?
Before that, I froze for a second when I went upstairs today to see my portrait in that glass cage 2 years ago. Exactly 2 years ago, I was in a Russian prison, and today I'm here. I'm so grateful to Reuters photojournalists to documenting that, because this is what happened 2 years ago. Now this is happening here. I'm sharing the stage with distinguished people, and we don't know what will happen in 2 years. And here we are to talk. So I've been through so many bad things. I really want to share my stories so we stop those things from happening, we stop detention of journalists. I was accused of not registering as a foreign agent. And before we start talking about that architecture of authoritarian control, let's think that doesn't come in a day. That was coming and developing in Russia for 10 years, more than 10 years. So first, the arrest doesn't come first. The arrest is shocking, brutal, but before that comes labeling. So Russian authorities were labeling media outlets and journalists. And it's not that somebody goes and voluntarily registered by the Justice Ministry saying that I'm a foreign agent. So this was the first case. My case was the first one when they accused me of that and put me to prison. But later on, the case which was introduced against me was based on my journalism. And here a couple of words what I've been doing, what I had been doing before my arrest. It's community journalism, it's ethnic journalism. I was delivering news and information in Tatar and Russian language to a very particular focused group in Russia. It's the Volga region, ethnic minorities, just so those communities stay informed about themselves in the first place, and then the world, what was happening. So it felt surreal. Nobody would understand why I ended up in prison. It was very hard. Exactly 2 years ago these days, I was, the court extended my detention for a month and a half. And the first month and a half were so hard, I can't even describe it with any words of in any language. And just every day I would expect every morning that I would open my eyes and the guards would come and say, also, this really had been a terrible mistake. We apologize. You are free to go and go to your family and to your colleagues. This is how surreal it was. And then on December 1st, they extended my detention for 2 more months, and then 2 more months. And I just realized that for the first thing I had to survive. So those the legislations against journalists doesn't include only foreign agent laws. We have Nika Novak in a Siberian penal colony, a Russian journalist, a beautiful young woman who was, again, doing something very similar what I had been doing, regional journalism, informing her own audiences there. And she was imprisoned for collaboration with a foreign organization, a very vague charges, where you can bring against her anything.
And this sort of vagueness is important, right? Because I remember you saying to me once, people kept coming to ask you about, the CIA and how Radio Free Europe was funded. And they're looking for kind of conspiracies. And this is how, and I know we're going to come on to talk about this in a second, this is how sometimes, quite often, these foreign agent laws get you, right? You're just doing your job. Most of the independent organizations can't operate without foreign funding. So you're caught in this net where just by doing the job of independent reporting, you're breaking the law because you're having to be funded, because no one in Russia was going to fund you to do this kind of work, right? So they were looking for that when they spoke to you, right?
Absolutely. And John would back me here. The law itself on foreign agent law, if you read it properly, it's not that. It's about foreign funding. It doesn't say anything about ideology or anything. But they would bring against it. Putting to prison was a clear signal to other journalists to stop doing what they were doing. That means covering the war, talking about ethnic minorities, about their rights, women's rights, that one thing. And the second thing, to put the person into the conditions where the person would just lose his or her dignity, and it's deprived of communication. So I was held in a cold cell for 6 months, and it was minus 30. There was no hot water, and for days, I know everybody's telling me that, wow, you're strong. No, I wasn't. There were like days and days where I wouldn't brush my teeth because I didn't have energy just to get up and leave my bunk bed just to warm up water and brush my teeth. I couldn't brush my teeth with ice cold water. But again, another thing, then the guard would bring me a couple of letters from outside. I was isolated from letters from my family, but as I realized there was a campaign around the world to write to political prisoners, and they included me when I was designated as a political prisoner in Russia. And then I would get a letter, like a short letter saying, hey, I'm here at the party. My friends are celebrating next room, but I took this time just to write to you that I remember you. And a name that I didn't even know. There was no town, but I realized from the stamps were windows to freedom. I realized it was from Berlin. Somebody, a Russian speaker, that was like the letters only in Russian would be allowed through the censorship there in prison. And you know what I did when I saw that? I would get up, warm up that water, brush my teeth, change the clothes if I had some changed clothes. This is how I survived, thanks to the community, the journalism, and supporters. And working with lawyers, another thing, and it's just incredible.
And I'm going to come back to Jan and the Radio Free Europe case and Europe in a second. But since we're on this question of sort of the things that gave you hope, maybe that's a good moment to bring you in, Nick, and talk about some of the work that Thomson Reuters Foundation been doing to build up the resilience of newsrooms, because this is a reality. I mean, much as we want to fix things at the macro level, which we'll talk to Jan about, this is a reality that many, many more newsrooms are going to have to face. How are you supporting them?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jodie and Alsu and Jan. A privilege to get to speak with you, and Alsu to share your story. It's a real honor to hear it and to hear that really personal impact of this legislation. And hopefully what I can shine a light on is that impact on a newsroom level and organizational. Because like Jodie said, we're trying to build the resilience of newsrooms that are impacted by foreign agent legislation. Now, I'll zoom in a bit specifically on Russia again in this circumstance, because since 2022, we've been running programs to support Russian media in exile. Now, many of those may already have designations such as foreign agent. Sometimes it can be more serious than that. There's a kind of a tier in Russia, then to undesirable organization, even to extremist organization. But many of those we work with aren't yet, but will have that fear looming. I mean, Catherine talked about the stigma on individuals, but also on those organizations, and trying to retain trust with their audience whilst they might have that stigma of being labeled as a foreign agent. So the ways that we build that resilience and ultimately keep them doing their work, because we see that as a way to counter these foreign agent laws. You know, these media can keep producing independent content, high quality, independent, fact-check content that reaches audiences in those countries. That in itself is fighting against the foreign agent laws, because that's doing exactly what they're trying to suppress. So one of the key ways we do that is legal support. So we've been able to make connections with leading law firms in the jurisdictions where these media are now based in exile to really make them operationally sound and compliant. You know, because let's talk about the example of 2022, many journalists and media from Russia moving into exile, maybe setting up in new jurisdictions in a completely new legal landscape. So they suddenly have to face things like GDPR legislation. And a lot of bureaucracy of its Germany, for example, France, a lot of these countries setting up as NGOs, it's bureaucracy that they've never faced before, and we can support with that. So making sure they're compliant with copyright, intellectual property, things like that. Now, I think it's important to note, because Georgia was mentioned obviously a few times today, and in Catherine's as well, Catherine's talk earlier, these laws are following some of these media around. So one of the key legal pieces of support we've provided is that registration. So supporting media to register and be legally compliant. But in the case of Russia, some of these Russian independent media initially set up in Georgia, and now they've moved again. And so our piece of resilience is actually preparing for the future, because we don't know. You know, in the past 2 years, think how much it's changed. I mean, the past 5 minutes, probably I haven't read the news because I've been here. But what more is to come? How can we make them operationally resilient? I think filling all those legal gaps is one way to do it out of a wider package.
Let's move to the other legal side of it, which is the kind of defense against this. Maybe, Jan, you can talk a little bit about the Radio Free Europe case, and then perhaps talk to us about what might be some of the strategies, given that we are seeing this huge proliferation. We do expect to see more of these laws in more places, which means we're going to see more of these organizations going into exile or having to challenge. So can you talk to us a little bit about the case, but also then some of the strategies you think we might need to tackle these laws?
So just sort of switching hats now, I acted for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty as its lead counsel before the European Court of Human Rights, challenging the foreign agents' laws. So this is really the other side to the coin that Alsu was talking about. I mean, the point of this legislation really is to stigmatize the individual journalists, and then to do more than stigmatize the individual journalist. But there's another part, which is to make it impossible for a media organization like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty to operate in the jurisdiction. And the challenge that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty brought before the European Court of Human Rights was to the legislation as well as its application to Radio Free Europe. They weren't alone. Of course, there have been many organizations that were affected, many journalists that were affected, many human rights defenders that were affected. Now, ordinarily in this scenario, the Strasbourg Court, the European Court of Human Rights, will grant priority for a case like this, bearing in mind the realities of what's going on on the ground. And the court did that in this case. And when I talk about the realities going on in the ground, we're talking about, you know, journalists having to leave Russia, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, having to move premises because otherwise the Russian state is going to take all of its assets, etc. And, you know, that is happening on a daily sort of basis. International courts, you know, quick turnaround is 1.5 years, maybe 2 years. So we asked for interim relief, i.e. an order from the European Court that Russia suspend all of its actions against Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. That's a very hard remedy ever to secure. We were not able to secure it. So what happened? We fought the case. We won the case. The judgment was handed down exactly this time last year. But of course, by that point, and it was a very, very sophisticated judgment, it found a violation of Article 10, right to freedom of expression, against the Russian Federation, and made very, very strong findings against the Russian Federation for what it'd done to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, as well as various journalists. But at the point at which that judgment was handed down exactly this time last year to the day, Russia had been thrown out of the Council of Europe. So good luck enforcing that judgment. And secondly, it was too late. And I make no criticism of the court, but it was too late because Radio Free, Radio Liberty had ceased to exist in Russia. So that now we're looking at Georgia as a jurisdiction that is following this pattern. The foreign agents law is before the European Court of Human Rights at the moment. But going to a human rights court is not going to be enough. It's a part of what one has to do, but it's not going to be enough. And that leads to your follow-on question. And I think the answer to that is, of course, I'm a lawyer, threefold.
Is that a thing?
Yes, yes, yes.
Sounds dangerous.
Yes. I think the first, I want to make sort of 3 points, and then we can sort of build on them. But I think the first thing I want to make, maybe
Can I
it's
just say you said that without irony? Earlier
Yes.
when we were talking
Yes.
in the green room, I said, I bet you at one point
Yeah.
you're going to do the lawyer thing where you say, I'd just like to make 3 points.
Yes.
You've just done it without irony. Yeah, sorry. Make your 3 points.
Yes. The first one is that we need to be really clear-sighted about this, by which I mean I think we need to acknowledge that restricting illegitimate foreign influence is itself legitimate, right? Democracies should be able, as a matter of principle, they should be entitled to take steps to protect themselves. Now, of course, that's not what foreign agent laws are doing. But the reason I start here is because what we're seeing is we're seeing democracies start considering what legislation might look like to limit foreign influence, for example, in elections, to bolster national security on the one hand, and on the other, we are seeing non-democratic nations promulgate increasingly sophisticated foreign agent laws. And within 2 years, this is what's going to happen. So when we are thinking about solutions and responses, I think we have to provide solutions and responses that are sophisticated and that give states the ability to protect their own democracies. The second point is the responses have to be coordinated at the level of NGOs, at the level of states, at the level of international organizations. And rather than simply responding, we need to anticipate. So one of the pieces of work that the high-level panel worked on with CPJ and a number of other organizations back in 2021 and 2022 was persuading states to establish an emergency visa for journalists at risk. And that emergency visa was established in certain states within Europe and then was used by some journalists fleeing Russia who had been designated as foreign agents. So we need to be 3 steps ahead. And the third point, non-ironically, we have to harness the full gamut of legal protections and the full gamut of the protections available in international law. Understandably, our focus to date has been harnessing international human rights law or domestic human rights law. But we need to do more than that. And we need to recognize, for instance, in this area, that a key Achilles heel for some of these states is economic. What do I mean by that? Some of the states now contemplating or passing these bills are the same states that are seeking increasing levels of foreign direct investment. There is an inherent tension between, on the one hand, asking the world to invest in your country, and on the other hand, to stigmatize that investment because it happens to be in media, etc. And in fact, this is not just a theory of mine. We have seen these arguments work in the last couple of years. Look at Hungary, look at Turkey. There are other examples of countries that we know were contemplating it, but never publicized it. But it's this investment flow and the risk to the investment flow that is a very, very powerful response. So we need to look at the law. We need to look at the interests in the broadest possible sense.
And of course, on the economic point, the withdrawal that we've seen in some instances of government funding or public funding for independent media overseas feeds into this additional punishment that you can mete out even to exile media if you withdraw the kinds of funding on which people rely, like Radio Free Europe. So as a reminder, you can ask questions in the Magic app, which magically appears on this screen, and I can then make sure that your question gets asked. So Alsu, there's a question for you here, which is, does the foreign agent designation still impact your life to this day, and in what ways?
The charges of foreign agent were dropped in my case because I was sentenced for 6.5 years for something more serious, which in Russian legislation is spreading fake information about the Russian military. And it came from the book that I co-edited with my colleagues at Radio Free Europe. The book is a collection of 40 stories. It's stories of 40 people who protested the war in the first months of when it started, the Ukrainian war. And now, 3 years later, it's even impossible to imagine that somebody in Russia could have said the words they said to us. They reached out themselves. It wasn't that our journalists were looking for those people. They really wanted to feel, be part of the community who were protesting. And they gave us their names. I'm so proud that they trusted us. They trusted our little team who worked in the Volga region, and they trusted their stories. So I was sentenced for that work. The accusation and the charges of foreign agent law never worked in my case. But Radio Free Europe, that I was part of, and I still do, I am part of the press freedom advocacy team there. Is not only a foreign agent but undesirable organization. It was designated as undesirable organization when I was in prison last year, and that's basically makes it illegal to not only to work with Radio Free Europe in Russia, but also participate in Vox Pop or give interviews or give any comments, even anonymously. And I know people who work, collaborate, or try to give some information to Radio Free Europe are being watched, and there is surveillance, and I know they're punished.
And I think the point that you made in your opening remarks are really important to note, that they didn't come out of nowhere, the foreign agent laws. They didn't come out of nowhere, the allegations that people were undesirable or organizations were undesirable and that we're going to penalize anyone for even giving information to them. That was a long time in the making. And I think that's what we're seeing through the Thomson Reuters Foundation research, and is that there is a clear sort of pattern where you can see this. And Nick, there's a question here which maybe I think I might direct to you, which somebody asked, for someone working in a media organization or an NGO that's starting to show signs, in a country that's starting to show signs of adopting foreign agent laws, what are some immediate and practical steps they can take today to protect their staff and work? I mean, I know there are lots of places that you can't talk about where you work, but what are some general things that you might say about how organizations can start to prepare themselves if they see this coming?
Yeah, so we've had conversations about this, thinking about media at risk or at risk of exile in lots of places across the world. And I've spoken with lots of our partners that are currently working in exile on that piece of hindsight, right? What would you have done if you'd had time to prepare? Some of it, again, is that legal side. So making sure that they have entities set up elsewhere, have entities in different countries, set up bank accounts elsewhere, so that if that point comes where you need to leave, you're ready and prepared, because that wasn't the case for a lot of the people we work with in exile, and you're having to do things kind of retrofit, which is always a lot harder. But I would also focus on, because Alsu just mentioned it, on safety and security. And actually a lot of our work now, aside from that legal part, is capacity building on safety and security. I mean, the newsrooms that we're working with are under such a high level of scrutiny, state surveillance, and they have to think of their physical security as well. And we've been able to support them to implement protocols in advance for the what if, or actually we often talk about when rather than if. So when that inevitability comes. And we've had examples in the past year on our program where those protocols were built, I think allowing a media to have capacity, and an organisation like ours that can build their capacity whilst they continue doing the important journalism, but we support them to build those protocols and policies. And then, yes, like I said, over the past year, a few of those media were hit with the designation, but those protocols were enacted. And the certain steps, and I can't go into detail on what the steps were, but they were taken, and the right people were protected, the right staff were made secure. And so it's often what people see as the boring stuff, the protocols, the policies, having them written down, it is really important in advance.
And I would add, making the assumption that it could happen to you. I mean, it's fascinating that the fastest growing area of query that we are having at CPJ from American organizations is people worried about their nonprofit status, because they see how that playbook has been weaponized in other countries to punish non-friendly media, or media that's perceived to be not. And we're already seeing that in the United States, where people for a long time would say this will never happen here, right? So it's also thinking about it even in places where you wouldn't have assumed that could happen.
And can I, because I thought it's preparing your audience as well. I think that's a really important piece. I mean, we talked, and Catherine mentioned about the stigma. You know, these laws and the name innoagent in Russia, you know, that holds such a stigma.
Yes.
And what we've done is that some media are preparing their audiences, or they've got statements ready to release if that designation comes, to really inform their audience and say, look, you can still read our content, you should still read our content, it is still trusted, but also think of the security of the audience. So there are some laws that mean they won't be able to donate anymore. So really make sure they're protected. So actually preparing all of that with your audience, because once that line of trust is broken, it's so hard to bring back. And that's what those laws are trying to do.
I think that's such a good point. And I think that brings us back to this question, and somebody's asked it, about the fact that we're seeing even EU countries adopt foreign agent laws, Jan. And the question is, does the EU itself have a position on this topic, or the power to influence any legislation? And are we going to see other European countries? What's your sort of take on the Europe angle?
It certainly has powers. But again, those powers need to be exercised in a way that doesn't boomerang back, right? This is really, really important. I mean, you remember the debacle around Russia Today, and I mean, when you look at all of that as a lawyer, maybe the result was defensible, but the means through which that result was achieved probably wasn't, and actually probably made it easier for Russia to create a brand new category above foreign agents, which is the undesirables law, etc. So the EU doubtless has powers, but it needs to be very, very, and other organizations, whether it's the African Commission in relation to the two countries that are going down this route, or the Inter-American Commission, or other expert bodies or international organizations, have to really think about the consequences of using those powers as well.
And there's a question here that I think is also for you, which is there a clear link between the kind of abuse of foreign agent laws and it making investment less likely? I mean, so you talked about using the economic stick. Is there evidence that shows that actually those kinds of laws are actually bad for people's economy?
There isn't at the moment, but one of the reasons there isn't is because, you know, when you have conversations about foreign agents laws, you're usually, you are challenging or attacking those foreign agents laws through human rights mechanisms, different part of the government. When you are thinking about entering into investment treaties or investment contracts, you are talking to a different arm, the government. And one of the things that we on the high-level panel trying to encourage some of the democracies to do is actually not work in silos, and actually to join the dots, so that departments of the Treasury or economy are shocked by what the government is doing elsewhere. And this is not just a private conversation. I think there's some public advocacy to be done in this regard, including with big businesses that are considering big investments, whether it's in tech, whether it's in natural resources, or something else.
We're coming just to the end of our time, and I wanted to give the last words to Alsu. You are the only practicing journalist, I would say, on this panel. I'm still in recovery. And you have experience of all of this. You've experienced it personally. You've had experience of how newsrooms deal with it. You've had experience of the law. You've had experience of being part of an international movement of solidarity spearheaded by your family, who I think are out there. Hello. Your amazing family who drove a lot of the advocacy. What are some of your key messages to those who want to fight back effectively against these laws? What are the key things, Jan's 3 points, whatever they be, what are the key things you think we need to take away to be able to effectively deal with these laws?
In this question, I will follow up, Chance. Join efforts. Join efforts. This is not the time to be separate. Not in journalism, not in advocacy, not in business, not in legislation, not in different. Maybe it might be different. I really enjoyed the panel on Gen Z before this. They said that it might be different in 6 months. But this is what it is now. Let's face reality. Let's be real now. Let's join forces. I'm doing advocacy. I'm not back in with the newsroom, though. Like I miss that a lot. I miss working on stories, but somehow I try to include my journalistic skills and experience to advocacy, to bringing the message of imprisoned journalists right now. But in advocacy, it works really well when we join forces, and not to be afraid to push a little bit more. My grandmother taught me a lot, and that helped me in prison. You never get the difficulties that you cannot overcome. If you're getting that, if you're facing them, that means that you can do it. It comes from any religion, it comes from any ideology. That we are facing this right now because we are strong and we can do it. So let's join forces and let's do it.
And I think that's a great note to end on. So thank you to you, and I look forward to collaborating.